speaker for this session, Serife Tekin. So Serife Tekin is Assistant Professor of Philosophy and Medical Humanities at the University of Texas at San Antonio. Her work lies at the intersection of philosophy of science and medicine, philosophy of mind and cognitive science, bioethics, and it has been heavily informed by feminist and social epistemology. She is the author of many papers about the inclusion of the self in scientific psychiatry, psychiatric taxonomy, AI and therapy for mental illness, and patients as experts in psychiatry. She's also the co-editor of two books, the Bloomsbury Companion to Philosophy of Psychiatry with Robin Bloom, and the Extraordinary Science in Psychiatry, Responses to the Crisis in Mental Health Research with Jeffrey Poland. So I'm now pleased to give the floor to Professor Serife Tekin for her talk entitled Rethinking Objectivity in Psychiatry, Unmuting Patients in Epistemic Practices.
That's great. Thank you for that great introduction, Anna-Marie, and thank you, Sarah and Anna-Marie, for organizing actually this wonderful webinar series. It's such a fantastic service and opportunity to philosophy of psychiatry, and I'm very, very excited to kind of see this unfold. It also feels a little bit like my wedding. I mean, I'm not married, but what would be my academic wedding, perhaps, because I see a lot of faces that I know I'm friends with in the philosophy of psychiatry community, but I also see a lot of people who I never got a chance to meet, but whose works I have been, heavily influenced by. So thank you all for being here. So today's talk will be coming out of my current book project. This is, this started off as my chapter 5, but now it's, slowly invading the whole book. So we'll see how that goes. And in some regard, it's kind of a, the outcome of a lot of my research to date. So I'm really excited to be, speaking out loud, like my ideas and my views, and I'll look forward to your questions. So. One of the, just to kind of get us started, throughout this talk, I'm going to think of psychiatry as an intervention-oriented science. I think it's very important to specify what kind of science it is to better understand the kinds of similarities and differences between psychiatry and other natural sciences and human sciences. And in that sense, psychiatry is an intervention-oriented science because its primary goal is to help alleviate the mental stress or mental disorder of those who desire their mental distress or disorder to be alleviated. So in that sense, as an intervention-oriented science, psychiatry aims to understand properties of mental disorders so that we can better explain what they are, make predictions about their course, and develop successful interventions. And where does the understanding of properties of mental disorders come from, which is the subject of psychiatric science? So first source of information is scientific practices. So these scientific practices include clinical research trials, neuroscientific research on the brain, a variety of practices that we can all kind of label under scientific practices. It also, the information about properties of mental disorders comes from clinical context, clinical practices. So these can be in the form of, medical case studies that maybe psychotherapists or psychiatrists publish based on their one-on-one experiences with their patients. The third source of information about properties of mental disorders comes from what I'm just going to label as testimonies. These testimonies, these kind of experiences about mental disorders might be coming directly from individuals who are diagnosed with mental disorders, but also those who, their family members, their caregivers, and other people around them. But in this talk, I will talk specifically about patients or those diagnosed individuals' own testimonies. And these come from now, in the last decade or so, there has been an increase in attention given to patients' voices, especially in Europe. And this might include like Hearing Voices Network. Some of its branches actually have been starting in the United States as well, Mad Pride movement, or people who are writing about their experiences. Interestingly, the kind of scientific psychiatry focused a lot on these scientific and clinical practices as sources of information for mental disorders, but they have not been similarly or equally committed to using first-person testimonies in understanding what mental disorders and developing clinical treatments. So, and my plan for the talk is going to be like this. So I'm first going to be so one of the reasons my diagnosis of the problem for like why patient testimonies have not been included in a systematic way in scientific psychiatry is the worry that if we include patients' perspectives, we are not going to be a science anymore, because science aims to be objective, and including patients' voices will kind of impede that goal of objectivity. So I'm going to start with unpacking that assumption that objectivity in psychiatry requires, scientific psychiatry requires, not including patients, and patient inclusion will impede objectivity. I'm going to look at some of the assumptions of objectivity in scientific psychiatry by looking at especially the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. This manual is created in the United States, but it's widely used around the world. And it has it's a document with a lot of power. It's used to advance clinical research, to advance scientific research, clinical treatment. It's used for educational purposes and various administrative purposes, insurance, as well as research funding, and developing a uniform language in which we talk about mental disorders. So it's a very powerful document, and I'm going to look at some of the assumptions about objectivity that underlies the kind of development and evolution of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And then I'm going to take an issue with the assumption about objectivity in the DSM, and will propose an alternative view in which I argue that patient inclusion is in fact necessary for attaining objectivity in psychiatry. And finally, I will deal with some objections and responses. So nobody one day woke up and decided to kind of create a Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorder that has had clear definitions of what it means to be an objective science and so on and so forth. So a lot of the our understanding of what might objectivity mean in the DSM-oriented psychiatry, especially, comes from a kind of historical evaluation, and also looking at what the creators of the DSM said as they were developing the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. So first of all, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders was created, the first edition was created in 1952. It came out during the Korean War, and the original purpose of creating a diagnostic manual was to better determine who was fit to go to war. So it was primarily a statistical document. It was created in collaboration with the organization that was the predecessor of the current American Psychiatric Association, in collaboration with the military. So, and at the time, the DSM-1 and the DSM-2 was heavily influenced by psychoanalytic psychology, because the primary scientific framework, or primary established framework for understanding mental disorders, was heavily driving on the Freudian framework. And then things have started changing. There was a shift from psychoanalytic psychology to a kind of more scientific way of understanding mental disorders around the, in 1970s and 80s, with the publication of the DSM-3. So as a philosopher, it's interesting, and I think it's important to kind of justify where our ideas about, psychiatry's assumptions come from. Some psychiatric assumptions about objectivity comes from. And for me, this means doing a very careful reading of the history of psychiatry and how the diagnostic manual in this context have evolved, but also using also doing a very careful reading of history of medicine. So I do not want to overstate any of the kind of considerations that I'm going to put forward right now, but this shapes my understanding of what psychiatry might have thought of as being an objective science. So as many of you are familiar, at the time, the Freudian psychoanalysis was very popular. In 1960s and 70s, it started facing a lot of criticisms coming from not only psychiatrists themselves, but also philosophers and other scholars at the time for it not being scientific enough. And the reason that it was not considered scientific enough was that psychoanalysis focused primarily on the causes of mental disorders, and that causal etiology was assumed to be taking place at the unconscious level, things that we can't really observe. And scientists wanted to kind of hold on to something and make actual observations. So at the time, the kind of main way of understanding what objectivity means in science was heavily shaped by logical positivism and what they consider to be scientific. And I'm going to argue, and at the same time, the medical model of disease was on the rise because we had now a better understanding of illnesses like syphilis, for instance, which has a lot of mental disorder symptoms. And we found out that there's actually a biological component that led to that, and we invented antibiotics and started treating syphilis effectively, and getting rid of like some of its mental symptoms as well. That kind of increased the optimism also in the world of medicine that we will also be able to identify kind of the causal etiology of mental disorders in the same way. So there was all these kind of, this was the zeitgeist of at the time, 1960s and 70s, that have led to changing the diagnostic manual to be more symptom focused, more focused on the observable signs and symptoms of mental disorders rather than their etiology, with the goal of making it more scientific. So, and the number of things were happening kind of when we look at the, what it means to be an objective science. The popular view at the time was logical positivism. And I'm going to argue that this heavily shaped the way the DSM creators were thinking about what it means to be an objective science. So let's kind of go over the kind of fundamental tenets of objectivity under logical positivism. So for logical positivists, objectivity of science is something that is about scientific knowledge. So it's about the outcome of scientific inquiry. And the justification for evidence comes all from observational data. So we can't really contest the things that we are all seeing. If we're all able to observe the same phenomena, then we will be able to arrive at objective knowledge. And there was this assumption that objective knowledge necessarily means this kind of objective, like view from nowhere, this third person knowledge. Everyone can agree on the observable findings. So in that sense, that's why there was a kind of move to describe mental disorders in relations to signs and symptoms, because those were the phenomena that we can all observe and witness. So they're not purely coming from first person or maybe subjective perspective. And there was also this ideal of value neutrality. Values should never be part of science. That will like kind of violate the objectivity of science. And the best kind of scientific inquiry in that sense can be conducted by experts who know this phenomena that they're studying really well. So in that sense, like both the DSM-1 and the DSM-2 was created by psychiatrists and neurologists at the time with some help from military. And military personnel were considered to be experts because they had direct experience with soldiers who were having some kind of mental breakdown and so on and so forth. So expertise was kind of defined as those with clinical and technical expertise and training, those trained in psychopathology who have some kind of a degree related to understanding psychopathology. So in that sense, there was also this equation of objective knowledge with expert knowledge. And we can gather all of this by just reading the introductions of the DSMs 1 to 5 in their explanation of who was part of the DSM process. So in neither of from the DSM 1 to 5, even in the earlier periods or the later periods of the DSM, patients or people who have experience with mental disorder were never considered to be groups who can be part of the DSM-5 or DSM creation process, even though this is a manual that aims to expand our scientific understanding of mental disorders, patients somehow were left out. Things started shifting around the DSM-5. There were extensive calls to the American Psychiatric Association coming from different groups to also include patients and their family members in the diagnostic creation process. So let them be part of the DSM task force that is in charge of creating the new manual. So these included psychiatrists themselves who've written on the importance of patient advocacy and patient representation in the creation of the DSM-5. There were philosophers and psychiatrists that we are very familiar with in the philosophy of psychiatry community, like John Sadler and Bill Fulford, who pushed for inclusion of patients and their families through the DSM-5 process. And there was this was a time in around 2010 where the Occupy movement was on the rise, and there were actually a lot of activists who were involved in the Occupy APA movement, and they were part of various protests and so on at the APA meetings, who wanted to be heard and have a seat at the table to create the DSM-5. So a lot of these arguments kind of appeal to democracy or democratic processes in wanting to include patients. So the argument goes something like this: well, democracy requires all stakeholders to be part of decision-making process. Patients and their families are stakeholders, therefore patients must be included in the decision-making process. I call these reasons primarily to be social and political reasons, not directly epistemic reasons. Of course, they have some kind of epistemic implications, but that wasn't the direct focus. And the DSM-5 task force actually responded very politically and interestingly. I think they said that they were open to inclusion of patients, but their response was kind of included more political reasons rather than epistemic reasons. And in fact, if anything, they were challenging the inclusion of patients from epistemic perspective. So they said, okay, so yeah, like patients are of course important part of the puzzle. How about we open the DSM-5 creation process to open to public? So they put a draft DSM-5 on their website. They invited everyone to comment and give feedback on it. So it's interesting that this process, kind of inviting everyone to comment on it, actually undermines patients, because patients were not included as a group of people who can make unique contributions to psychiatric knowledge, but rather they were included insofar as they're members of the public. And then with that, they received that feedback and they reported that they actually took that public feedback into consideration, but I haven't seen a systematic study of how that feedback was incorporated. Rather, though, they kind of resisted just including the patients as a patient group by appealing to psychiatry's objectivity to be an objective science. So this is what the DSM task force actually published a paper saying this: by definition, subjectivity is variable from person to person, therefore making it impossible to develop objective criteria that would apply to every disorder. Further, it raises the question of whose subjective experience will serve as a template by which criteria would be developed. So unlike philosophy papers that we are used to writing, when psychiatrists kind of throw these words like extremely complex notions like objectivity or subjectivity that philosophers spent a lot of time thinking about, they don't actually kind of make a clear, explicit definition of what they have in mind. And that's why we have to kind of go back to like thinking about what they might be thinking. So their notion of objectivity is under-examined here, but they seem to be kind of talking about objectivity in a way that's very similar to how logical positivists thought about objectivity, in that objective knowledge or objectivity was a characteristic attributed to all outcome of scientific inquiry. It necessarily meant like value neutrality because it wasn't going to be considering these subjective perspectives, but rather objective, like this detached view of what mental disorders are. And they thought patients' inclusion will violate that. So I'm going to challenge this notion of objectivity that is operating in the DSM's reasoning And I'm going to argue that we need to kind of alter, or work with that definition of objectivity. And we can take a lot of cues about how to change this notion of objectivity by looking at feminist philosophy of science and social epistemology. So here's like my kind of most important argument. I think patients must participate in psychiatry for primarily epistemic reasons. Social and political reasons and inclusion or democratization of science is very, very important, but that's secondary for my purposes here. The patients must be included for epistemic reasons because they have something that is unique and indispensable to contribute to the picture. And their inclusion and interaction with other experts in the psychiatric community is in fact necessary for objectivity. Not only it will not impede objectivity, but unless they're included, psychiatry will not be an objective science. So the notion of objectivity that I'm pushing for, following feminist epistemologists, emphasizes on the importance of making sure that the process of scientific knowledge production is objective, and that it embraces that psychiatry or science values are part of science and scientific work. And it emphasizes the importance of interaction between different kinds of experts in the group. So let me just kind of unpack this a little bit more. So I say patients must participate as kind of for epistemic reasons. And in this, I think of patients as knowers. And I draw a lot of similarities here between kind of what I'm talking about what especially early feminist epistemologists have talked about. So for instance, in Lorraine Code, we learn a lot about the importance of important epistemic implications of individuals' social locations, such as knowers' gender. Similarly, in Sandra Harding's work, we learned a lot from how failure to account, for instance, women's experience will result with androcentric assumptions in science and scientific research. And similarly, looking at science and technology studies scholars who have written a lot on what it means to be an expert, they kind of made this very important and very useful for psychiatry distinction between those experts who are technically qualified by training and those who are technically qualified by experience. So experts in Collins and Evans's view, for instance, do not only include people who have MD or PhD degrees, but experts can also have expertise just by virtue of their experience. And in this context, their direct experience with mental disorder. So in that sense, there are epistemic locations of patients' material conditions. And in an earlier paper, I talked about how patients' experiences and the kind of the knowledge that they have of mental disorders might actually offer some evidence that are overlooked in conventional clinical or scientific settings. So they have something that is very unique to offer. So now that means I want to consider patients as knowers and who are experience-based experts. So this is kind of where things start getting a little bit messy. So far I've talked of patients as if they're like this homogeneous group, right? And some people actually might even challenge me calling individuals who are diagnosed with mental disorders as patients, because there are a lot of people who embrace that they have a mental disorder, but they won't accept, the label of patient. So in that sense, those diagnosed with mental disorders, or maybe those who encounter mental distress, and whether or not they want to be corrected or kind of get better or not, that's an open question. They're not a homogeneous group, but there is an increasing number of people coming from different socioeconomic backgrounds and different kinds of agendas who have been talking about their experiences with mental disorders. We have some super kind of overachieving, successful individuals like Ellen Sachs, who has written about her experience with schizophrenia and how kind of she flourished despite kind of this limitations that were brought by her illness experience. We have a lot of scholars who talked about the individuals who talked about their, race and mental disorders and how they interact with one another. We have a lot of activists who have written about their experience with homelessness and poverty and their experience in the mental health system. There's a big mad pride movement who wants to embrace neurodiversity and want to resist psychiatric labels, and so on and so forth. So there are lots of individuals who are talking about their experiences of mental disorders. And this is how it gets a little bit more complicated in the sense that, but for my purposes here, I want to consider all of these individuals as knowers because they have some kind of expertise on mental disorder or mental disorder treatment just based on their experience. But I see an immediate objection here. You might say, well, wait a second. So like you're moving a little too fast. Patients are already part of the picture, right? In the DSM is created by psychiatrists who have direct encounter with patients, and their kind of, their identification of the list of symptoms and signs is coming directly from the kind of process that they go through in their clinic. So they're not just inventing things, they're not just making things up. It's all based on already what they're seeing in the clinical context. So my response is this. I think it's important, of course, kind of what psychiatrists, of course, they're experts, they're also experts in what they kind of, how they observe their patients and what they bring to the table in the DSM-5 task force. But also psychiatrists and clinicians work within existing paradigms and frameworks, which might kind of overlook some of the things that patients are reporting, but that doesn't really fit into predetermined categories. So in that sense, those kind of structured responses that they get in the clinical context might suffer from what I have called, what we might call thin or hyponarrativity. And this notion of hyponarrativity comes from John Sadler, and I really encourage you kind of to take a look at that concept kind of more closely, meaning that it lacks detail. It lists the symptoms, but it doesn't give us the context of those symptoms. And also, I think there's an important difference between kind of patients as objects of inquiry and patients as subjects of inquiry. So when the patients are in the clinic and talking to the psychiatrists, and then psychiatrists are gathering that information and kind of, representing the DSM task force, we think of them as like objects of inquiry. They're objects of inquiry. They're objects of psychiatrists' study of patients. But here I'm talking about patients' direct involvement, maybe as being having representatives in the DSM task force where they speak for themselves. They are the subjects of inquiry. So then how will this look like? Okay, so what will actually patients bring to the table that we cannot gather about them through psychiatrists? So here are some examples. I have previously called this orientational challenges of experiences with mental disorders. And by orientational challenges, I mean like this just pure experience of like not wanting to get out of your bed in the morning because you're depressed, right? Like what, that kind of first person, what is likeness of encounter with mental distress. So for instance, a lot of individuals with schizophrenia report this kind of flattening in their affect and kind of, like not really kind of wanting to, not being in a kind of social space. They're experiencing alogia or evolution. And that's kind of how it's described in the DSM. So this is usually kind of thought of as, it's described in the DSM as like lacking interest in social relationships. That's like one of the symptoms of schizophrenia. But actually, when you talk to individuals or when you read reports of individuals with schizophrenia, they kind of talk about like, actually, it's not really lacking interest. Like they do desire, but they're unable to kind of have such relationships and so on, right? So, and I think this is a difference that we will kind of catch if we rely just on psychiatrist reports of patients versus hearing from patients themselves. Another thing that we understand better by speaking to individuals who are experiencing mental disorders is like this kind of complex, juicy narrative that surrounds their mental disorder experience, right? How their intersectionality as a, Black woman living in 2020 in the United States does kind of shape or interact and influence their encounter with mental disorders. These are the kinds of things that we won't necessarily immediately find in a third-person observational report of individuals with mental disorders. And also we can gather a lot of information about like how certain psychiatric diagnoses and certain psychiatric treatments helped or hurt maybe patients in developing responses to their mental disorders. Again, they are the best experts that will give us feedback on this. We can also look at, what Ian Hacking called like looping effects, and what I call reflective impact of psychiatric diagnosis, how being labeled with a psychiatric diagnosis affect the way these individuals will think about themselves and how they respond to their illness and other aspects of their lives. It gives us a lot of information about what helped people cope better. And again, this is an important clinical property. This is a clinical phenomena that we should understand better so that we can help people more. But again, this doesn't really only come from individuals who have like medical training in psychiatry. And finally, another thing that I think reading or studying closely what patients are saying can give us kind of more idea about like what it means to actually have a mental disorder to begin with. Is that really incompatible with like flourishing as individuals? It kind of expands our horizon in the way that we think about mental disorders, that is not purely under kind of the maybe colonization of like psychiatry, like, right? Like maybe we will like look at different cultures and different experiences and think about the compatibility of happiness and mental disorder and so on and so forth. So, but then how will this look like in the end, right? Like so this is kind of, I'm talking about objectivity now. So far we have not just the experts who are clinically trained or who have MDs and PhDs, but we also have now patients as expert knowers about mental disorders. But we still need a kind of a picture of this process of science that will yield to kind of an objective science. So that's what I call here participatory interactive objectivity. And some of the language that I use here is heavily informed by Heather Douglas's work. That scrutinizes the notion of objectivity in science. It's I think a must read for a lot of, especially psychiatric scholars, I think, to kind of think about objectivity in more complex ways. So in this ideal picture of kind of objectivity of psychiatry, this is what I have in mind. Like patients and other experts interact because science is social knowledge, and objectivity is a feature of scientific process. So in that sense, we don't think about objectivity in this alternative view as the opposite of subjectivity, but rather it's this process where different standpoints, different expertise interact with one another to control for potential biases and potential problems, and each expert kind of challenges each other's idea. And that's kind of where I'm going with this, like this idea of transformative criticism that Helen Longino extensively has written about. So in that sense, this is how it's going to look like. So this participatory intersubjective objectivity, in this view, so the agents of science creation, right? Agents of knowledge production include scientists who are technical experts, clinicians who are also technical experts, but also individuals with mental disorders who are experience-based experts. And they will be using kind of this process of scientific activity to go through what Longino called transformative criticism. In Longino's view, we can arrive at objectivity of scientific processes by thinking about how different perspectives and different standpoints kind of get into the scientific process, and we can kind of check and control for different kinds of biases and prejudices and so on and so forth. One distinction that I draw between this view and Longino's view of transformative criticism is that Longino thought of scientists as primarily the agents of knowledge production, whereas I want to think of experts as agents of knowledge production, which doesn't include just scientists or clinicians in this context, but also individuals who have expertise based on their experiences. But again, this is kind of, where just like there's no homogeneous, patient group, there's no homogeneous clinician or scientist group. So we need to guide this process of doing science collectively by some values. So there has to be explicit avenues for criticism, and this will require some thinking in the psychiatry and even in philosophy of psychiatric community, because we need to create these avenues that will bring technical experts together with experience-based experts. So this might mean conferences that include, people who are diagnosed with mental disorders and their therapists and clinicians and so on. This might mean some journals that will publish articles coming from different perspectives and so on and so forth. In the context of the DSM, this will require inclusion of patients in the creation of the diagnostic framework. And the other important thing here is there's going to be a desire to kind of make things hierarchical, right? Like some clinicians might think that they know better than their, patients. And some patients might think that clinician or psychiatrist because they think that they know better. So in that sense, there must be a recognition that intellectual authority about mental disorders must be shared. For that, we need to trust each other, right? Experts must trust each other's judgment and perspective. And that's going to require a lot of work because a lot of, especially kind of individuals coming from ex-patient or mad pride movement feel, historically injustice by the psychiatric establishment. There needs to be some kind of amends made, that people need to kind of start talking to each other and trust each other. There must be openness to criticism on all parties, that we must, when a psychiatrist is challenged by the patient, they might not just kind of undermine the patient as just another crazy person who doesn't know what they're talking about. They have to be open to criticism. And being a patient or being a scientist or being a clinician does not give one automatic epistemic privilege. So we have to figure out, what makes a person kind of an expert, and we have to kind of figure out the nitty-gritty details of that. And last but not least, we should be very, very attentive of tokenism. So we can't have just one patient maybe kind of representing an advocacy group that not a lot of other patients are on board with and say, hey, we have experts. So, this is very much I think a lot of work and conversation is happening right now when it comes to diversity and inclusion, right? No diverse person wants to be a token anymore. And we have to kind of have a more serious conversation about what does it mean to actually represent and be part of the conversation and so on and so forth. So again, this is a general wish list. But another objection here might come, well, look at you, you're giving all this powerful kind of, you're making all these powerful attributions to individuals with mental disorders, but maybe they are not the perfect agents for having a voice at the table, because don't we know that mentally ill patients lack rationality? So how can we really trust them that they will be reliable, advocate, or they will be reliable, they will be giving us reliable testimonies? How do we not know that they're lying, or maybe they're just kind of on the throes of their mania and they're just speaking their mind? But first of all, I think this is more of a stigma and prejudice than actual fact. There's no conclusive data that supports that patients kind of lack rationality or rational decision making. We can, of course, talk about different kinds of limited epistemic agencies in the way that we can talk about limited epistemic agencies of psychiatrists, clinicians, and other experts. But we also know that mental illnesses do not necessarily or universally interrupt epistemic agency. Not all conditions create impairments, or they don't create impairments consistently. They might have some episodic nature. And if they do, they have varying degrees of severity and transiency. So, and the other thing that I think we learn a lot from feminist epistemology and feminist philosophy of science is that, there's some kind of a selection criteria that goes into picking who will be part of the scientific community that ends up kind of going through this transformative criticism. We can talk about similar things in the kind of patient or ex-patient kind of community as well. So those are all objections that we can address. So I'm going to end with an example from the very own history of the DSM here that further emphasizes, I think, what we have that we can gain by including patients into the creation of the DSM manual or in psychiatric science in general. So as many of you know in the group that homosexuality was considered a mental disorder back in time. And there were increasing kind of unsettlement, both from coming from the community and the public at large, about labeling that homosexuality as a mental illness, but also within psychiatry's like own psychiatrists. In fact, there's a great This American Life episode that I always assign to my students about the change in the DSM and the removal of homosexuality from the DSM. That gives a lot of life to how individuals in the DSM community, in the psychiatric community, were also big activists for removing the homosexuality from the mental disorder categories. And the biggest example here of this is this doctor called John Fryer. We also know him as Henry Anonymous. So there was a lot of like advocacy and activism going around removing homosexuality from the DSM, but it wasn't really going anywhere. There wasn't kind of, the DSM task force wasn't really kind of coming forward yet. But in this kind of historic meeting in 1972 at the American Psychiatric Association meeting, Dr. John Fryer, who was himself gay, and he was fired from several of his jobs because he was gay, and he was working as a psychiatrist. So he spoke at that meeting, but he wore that mask because he did not want his face to be identified, and he called himself Henry Anonymous to not be identified. And this was kind of that, like, I think, like the perfect storm or the pivotal movement. We can't, of course, give him all the credit for changing or for removing the homosexuality from the DSM. But in that speech, he talked about his own experience as a psychiatrist and how he was stigmatized and lost job. But, he's also a psychiatrist, and, he talked about how unreasonable to include homosexuality as a mental disorder in the DSM. And it worked. After that, actually, the DSM changed, and homosexuality was removed from the DSM. I give this example for two reasons. What's really interesting here is I think Dr. Henry Anonymous would not have been as successful if he was not a psychiatrist. But I don't think he would have been that successful if he was not gay either. Right? So in this sense, I think the kind of psychiatric community and the activist community at this intersection, they kind of trusted this person. They trusted his testimony because, well, okay, he's gay and a psychiatrist, right? So he's representing kind of both of these constituents. So there was that kind of shared trust and understanding that, we all like share some kind of intellectual authority about this experience, and that worked. And I think that's a really good example for us to kind of think forward as we think forward about how we might make the scientific community in psychiatry more diverse and inclusive of patients themselves. And that's all I have to say. I hope I did not go over time. Thank you so much for listening. And this is my cat Chicken, who is fighting for cat representation in the philosophical community. So.
All right, thank you so much, Serife, for this wonderful talk. Very interesting, very rich. I'm sure there are many questions that will follow.
So for the questions, if you don't mind writing in the chat instead of raising the hand, it's going to be easier for us to see the order of people wanting to ask questions, because with all the hands raised, we don't see who is first. So if you don't mind, just write in the chat when you have a question. And we are going to start with Natalia Washington.
Hi, Serife. Hi,
Natalia. Great to see you.
Hey, good to see you too. So I love your talk. As is probably not surprising, I agree with mostly everything you said. But John isn't here, and so I think he's not here. John, are you here? So I'm gonna kind of ask a question in his
question.
Yeah. So And also, I mean, like partially because I'm interested in like how you might respond for my own edification. So you start out by saying that psychiatry is an intervention-oriented science. And one reaction that somebody who is more interested in like the underlying neurobiology of mental disorders might have is something like, I take your point that patient's testimony is like a valid piece of the puzzle, but it's not the piece which is going to get us the outcome or the knowledge, the type of knowledge that we want, when the type of knowledge is the causal that they're only helpful when they like have a right causal relation to the biological intervention that's under that or something like that. So what would you say to that kind of perspective?
That's a great question, Natalia. And I think there are like multiple ways that we can go. Like I can kind of take the more maybe like reconciliatory approach and say, well, you know, look, like even in the context, even if we assume that, you know, the biology or neurobiology in the end will just give us everything that we need, like we'll get there. Science is not there, but we'll get there. Even in that context, I think kind of patients' own inclusion, not just as kind of like subjects in the, you know, fMRI machine or something, like not just their brains, but their kind of verbal reports, their experiences and so on. That's like an important part of the puzzle. In fact, I've been collaborating with some psychologists here at UTSA, and it's very interesting to be working with them because, you know, they measure a bunch of like phenomena, like with surveys, like resilience and so on and so forth. But, you know, in order to detect something like interoception, for instance, like how, you know, individuals with TBI sense their own bodies and stuff, they also add a heart rate monitor there or, you know, like do some blood tests and stuff. So I think that's like a more reconciliatory approach. But my other kind of maybe more radical approach that, you know, maybe represents what I really think about this is that I don't think that we can understand mental disorders or experience with mental disorder just by biology ever. That's not because biological or neurobiological science is not there, but you know, reductionistic frameworks, even if it's just you know, social and, you know, social determinants of mental health or something like that, will not get us there. And I think and actually in the kind of paper version of this talk, one of my starting assumptions is basically the title of Jeff Poland and I's book, where we characterize like mental health research as in being in crisis. There are so many different kinds of paradigms. Everybody's excited about something, and now there's RDoC. Even in a kind of RDoC like category, there's a category of self-reports there that they anticipated aligning with the other biological markers, but not much has been done in that self-report you know, category as much as it's been done on like the brain category or like genetics category and stuff like that. So I think that's kind of my more like radical approach. Hey, like we tried all of these like piecemeal approaches and like none of them patients were part of it, but how about let's look at kind of, you know, what patients are saying, because I feel a lot of energy coming out of like these different, you know, non-homogeneous patient advocacy groups and reports of like doing much better. I mean, I don't know what, you know, what you can kind of infer out of that, especially from a scientific perspective, but I think it's worth a shot.
Cool. That's kind of what I was hoping you would say. Thank you.
Thank you.
Serife, I don't know if you want to try and share your screen, maybe to have like
that's a great
better view of everyone. The next question is from Aude Bandini.
Thank you very much. So, hi, Serife, thank you very much. And as you can see, I have a lot of epistemic authority. Thanks to. So, once again, thank you very much for your talk. I have a conceptual issue, as we philosophers usually do, related to the idea of patients, specific patients' expertise, or what is called patients' experiential knowledge in the social sciences. And I feel like there is a problem in attributing knowledge or expertise to patients, since in ordinary language, knowledge and expertise are not only used in a descriptive, but rather in a normative sense that makes their conflation with lay experience a bit odd, if not meaningless. And to be an expert, according to social epistemology, is also to be socially recognized and praised as such. And why is the expert praised? Because she is extremely knowledgeable in a given field or activity, and because she is also publicly acknowledged as successful in it. But if you go that way, you could ask whether what would be the expert patient. So that would be, according to the aforementioned definition of expertise, that would be someone that is publicly deemed successful in her domain of expertise, namely living with the disease. So there would be more or less successful ways to be ill or to live with a whatever unpredictable and debilitating disease. So would you go as far as saying that there are good patients, or there are better ways to be ill than others? And if there are, who has the authority to either grant or deny the success to the patient on the way they cope with the disease? And so far, it is still the exclusive privilege of physicians and healthcare providers. So what I see in the field as working on patients' expertise, but in somatic and chronic disease, is that the expert patient is just the good patient, the compliant patient, the patient you want to work with. Because she has a PhD, for example, she speaks the same language and so forth and so on. Nobody wants, say, in type 2 diabetes, no physician or healthcare provider wants to acknowledge as an expert someone which is obese, amputated, almost blind, who doesn't take her medication and so forth and so on. So do you see my?
I totally do. That's a fantastic question. And like in the kind of last, like one of the last slides where I was kind of making this wish list of like, what will this look like? And this is one of the things that I've been thinking about, right? Like what makes a patient expert? So one of the things is, who acknowledges it and what do we do? And that's, I think we should look at feminist philosophy of science and some social epistemology for some guidance, but like here are kind of certain things that maybe we can kind of think about. Being a patient, I think, does not, assuming that, even being a patient, like that's not even a homogeneous thing, does not give someone an epistemic privilege and automatic, like it does not make them an expert automatically. But what does that mean? So historically in psychiatry, like for instance, when Kay Jamison's memoir came out back when I was a graduate student, and I didn't even, at the time, I hadn't even really thought of maybe incorporating patients' first-person testimonies in my dissertation, because I was like, oh my God, like that's not real philosophy. I was terrified. But then that memoir got so much attention. And I was thinking about recently, why did that work? Or a lot of kind of really respected poets and artists, when they write about their depression, and they call it Black Dog or whatever, we're all fantasizing depression and so on. And it's not, some of those memoirs are actually not they're written by privileged people. They have some kind of privilege, and their experience may not be of, people who are, living in poverty, who are not as articulate, who are not like literate. So I don't want to kind of, exclude people who cannot articulate their experiences as well as a PhD would do, right? So, and that's the real challenge. And I think it might get in the way of the kind of science that I'm dreaming of. But there are certain things that we can do. So Katie Plaisance recently published this article in Synthèse, where she's talking about philosophers as kind of translator experts, possibly, right? Kind of people in the middle, like they're not, scientists or clinicians and not patients themselves, but they do some kind of, work of like translating different things. So we can kind of think of ways in which we can better represent like patients' voices. But also, I think the question of like, how do we judge who we have between different, I hate this word, between different stakeholders. Kind of, there are lots of individuals. So I don't want to, like, just kind of coming back to your question, I don't want to give an ideal picture of a patient expert because I want to see what people are saying and how we might think about it. But in Netherlands, for instance, there is actually a job called being a patient expert. So these are, and it's mostly used in the clinical context. I think it's a fascinating idea. So they have to have some kind of experience with mental supporting and helping patients. Philosophers in Netherlands who are concerned question.
Thank you.
Okay, next question is from Hannah O'Ryan.
Hi, Serife. Thank you for the talk. Hi. So I just have a really basic question, which maybe we can talk about more later, but you've described psychiatry as an intervention-oriented science. And I guess coming from like a history of medicine perspective, that kind of interests me, the relationship between medicine and maybe like particular scientific disciplines. So we've got this kind of theoretical context and then also the clinical context. And I like that you're focusing on the DSM because it really links those really theoretical and really practical contexts. But yeah, I'm just kind of interested in whether we would really, like for me, I'm not super comfortable calling psychiatry so a scientific discipline specifically. Like when you say scientific psychiatry, I mean, so the way that we're describing the psychiatric community, it looks like it doesn't quite match up with these sort of like ideal scientific communities for sure. And I guess I think of medicine as this thing where we have kind of like professions and practices, concepts, tools. We're drawing on different sciences, but I'm just interested in this question of psychiatry as a science.
That's great. Thank you so much for that question, Hannah. And that's a very important question, I think, not just like psychiatry and medicine, but also philosophy of psychiatry and philosophy of medicine. So I'm a very pragmatist philosopher insofar as like I kind of take the institutions for their word. And because my focus has been primarily on the DSM, psychiatry or the DSM-based psychiatry does describe itself as a branch of medicine and a branch of science, right? Art and science of medicine. Like that's kind of a lot of psychiatrists kind of think about themselves as like kind of being at that like very own intersection. So when we look at philosophy of science, there's usually kind of an implicit assumption that kind of maybe like explanations and interventions don't look very different from each other. Kind of like, there's like a unity thesis, like the phenomena that will help us explain stuff will also help us intervene and so on and so forth. And I think a lot of like psychiatry, especially DSM-oriented psychiatry, took that kind of, for granted that whatever will help us explain will also help us intervene, and hence a lot of emphasis has been made on, I think, biological parameters of mental disorders, because there's a very explicit like mechanism and a cure, like a drug or something like that. So so in that sense, when I describe psychiatry as an intervention-oriented science, I'm actually kind of playing with some of the language that psychiatrists themselves are using in describing themselves as scientific. And if you read the introductions of the DSM, like 1 to 5, actually, in all of them, they do talk about the importance of advancing the science of psychiatry so that we can develop better medical interventions. And in my work, I have been trying to separate some of these goals from one another. So I'm very interested in mental disorders insofar as it affects people, and it affects people who want to change something about themselves or something about their experiences so that they don't kind of experience the pain of mental disorder anymore. So that's kind of like the first puzzle and piece. But that said, I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done in kind of better articulating what the DSM or what psychiatry and psychiatric science actually does. So philosopher Miriam Solomon has this concept of epistemic ritual, where she talks about how different scientific communities work together to gather knowledge and understand phenomena. And she worked on like evidence-based medicine context. And I think we can use something like that as an umbrella term for psychiatry in general, because some of that psychiatry is like, some of the epistemic ritual involves like creating things like the DSM, but some of it involves, oh, actually Miriam is here. And some of that involves, like kind of working, I don't know, putting a bunch of brain cells in a stem cells in a dish and pouring medications over it and so on. So in that sense, I think like psychiatry is like a whole collection of different sub-scientific disciplines. And in my view, it heavily relied on mostly natural sciences, and in that kind of epistemic ritual umbrella, under that umbrella, we need more social sciences, anthropology, and even like philosophy, to be honest. Yeah.
Thank you.
So hopefully that helps.
Yeah, thanks.
Next question is from Keyao Yang.
Yes, thank you, Serife, for your presentation. I enjoy it very much. So one thing I was thinking of when listening to your presentation was about epistemic injustice, and especially hermeneutic injustice. So I can imagine like the field of like psychiatry has kind of more readily available systems of language of describing and explaining the things that are going on with patients. And usually the patients need to different degrees, learn the language of the clinicians and the scientists and to communicate with them. So regarding this phenomena, I think one question people might have is like, when we talk about like patient experts, would it be the case that the patient expert we get are just patients who are in different degrees compliant to that language and end up like describing their mental illnesses as different things because they comply to that language to different degrees? Mm-hmm. And another thing, also another question I think this potential worry also generates is the worry that like, how can we provide, like in order to fully kind of appreciate the potential value that patients can give you in this, in the science of psychiatry, we do want the patient to have their own language or proper systems of language to describe what's going on with them. But I wonder how we can achieve that.
That's a fantastic question, Keo. And I have not written yet on various issues, various implications of some of my views in the kind of context of epistemic injustice. But I'm very happy to see that there's a lot of interest kind of in that area. Like Megan Delahante has been working on a paper, and there are lots of, I think, things that we have to think about and consider. So the DSM, so language of, so the starting point, I think we have a linguistic poverty in describing and talking about our mental experiences in general. And unfortunately, as I see in a lot of my college students, there's a tendency to describe what's going on in us by using the language, the kind of the dominant DSM language of thinking about mental disorders. And we even have a lot of actually first-person memoirs, first-person reports that I would hesitate, for instance, to call those individuals who's written those as experts necessarily, because they kind of take on board the language of the DSM. And so like, they just keep talking about highs and lows, like not, what does that actually mean in the context of, your own experience? We can't gather that much information. So talked about that in the context of like being hyponarrative, like not being a rich narrative that actually describes further the phenomena, but rather it imitates. But I think the patients are not really, or even my students are not to be blamed here, because sometimes to be taken seriously in the medical context, you have to use that language. That kind of gives more, legitimacy into like almost like your concerns. Like if you, describe your experience in this like, wonderfully like poetic way or whatever, your doctor might decide that you're delusional or something like that, right? So it's kind of this like double-edged sword. And I think that's why I'm excited that philosophy of psychiatry is happening at large, because I think we are kind of able to problematize some of these conceptual things. And epistemic injustice literature, I think, is one of them, right? One could talk about, so epistemic injustice in kind of the original inception has the hermeneutic injustice component. I think individuals who do not get to have some kind of alternative vocabulary to talk about their mental disorders experiences, but they just kind of can only use the, DSM vocabulary, are suffering from some kind of hermeneutic injustice, because the way you interpret your experience shapes the kind of responses that you have to them. And if you're suffering from that conceptual poverty for reasons that are not your own doing, then that creates a problem. So in that sense, I think like I'm really, really excited to talk and think more about like epistemic injustice literature in this context. So, but like in the kind of, for the purposes of this paper or this talk, I think I feel very comfortable saying that those super hypernarrative first-person testimonies that almost kind of reflect what we already see in the language, they're not like good representatives of patients. And that's why I think tokenism is very dangerous, because there are actually some mental health organizations that individuals who experience mental disorder are like hate, because they get funding from pharmaceutical companies, and they are very close with psychiatrists and so on. So I really would hate to see the DSM-5 inviting one of those representatives and saying that these are the patient's voice, which I don't think they are. So thank you for that.
Thank you. That's really helpful.
Next question is from Julio Ozores.
Hello, yes, my name is Julio Ozores. I'm a recently retired psychiatrist. Thank you, Dr. Tekin, for the very, very wonderful talk. I changed my original question to a follow-up that was provoked by Bandini Audi's very interesting comments. The idea that if we're going to deem a patient expert or to have expertise, that one way that this will be socially, recognized or fostered is who is living well with the condition. And it struck me that in psychiatry, that has happened a little bit already in the case of alcohol use disorders or alcoholism. Many years ago, the experts on treating alcoholism were psychiatrists. And for many years now, it's a part of the standard advice that AA knows better than how to treat alcoholism. So that was something that I was very much in my daily practice. I would tell people, Have you talked to your AA sponsor? Have you gone to an AA meeting? Because they know better than I do about how you treat with that. So that's a change that has happened within psychiatry. The people living well with a condition are granted special expertise, and you say, I can help you with this part of this, but go to AA for another part of it.
That's a fantastic question and point, Julio. That's wonderful. And in fact, I absolutely agree with you, right? We see that like in the the advantage of, I think, relying on other people who have had similar experiences with you, with the AA networks, or even Hearing Voices network that originated in Belgium. There individuals who hear voices report benefiting tremendously from belonging to a community and so on. And again, like I think just like this is like basic human condition. We are social beings and we flourish better around individuals who have like similar experiences to us and who we can share and so on and so forth. And that's kind of what also is perhaps puzzling when it comes to academic psychiatry and scientific, because when I talk to a lot of clinicians like yourself, they're like, yeah, of course, like this makes a lot of sense. Like, why would anyone, isn't this obvious? Isn't this something that we already do? Yet when you come to that like kind of high maybe level of, the DSM decision making and creating these categories and stuff, it's almost kind of, there's this like blindness to what's already taking place in the field. So I think, speaking about these kinds of actual, successful practices, I mean, AA helped so many people and trying to kind of use these as arguments to support like why we need maybe better representation, patient representation in the DSM task force and so on would be really, really useful. But I hadn't, thought of combining those two pieces together. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
So next question is from Jake Jackson.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I am very sympathetic to a lot of the positions that you've made here, and particularly I'm interested though in terms of what you think would work in terms of establishing a better system of trust between psychiatry and patient narratives. Specifically. I've been doing a lot of thinking about the Dr. Henry Anonymous, John Fryer episode, right, where he, is doing this specifically because his career is under threat in terms of the number of times that he's been fired and the number of times that he's been edged out of work and that he might be pushed out of the profession in general. That to some extent seems not quite the case for people who are suffering from mental disorder, however, in the sense that in outing oneself and saying, or disclosing and saying, well, this is the disorder that I have, seems to be sort of a unnecessary career suicide at times, right? And it does seem that the people who do end up publishing memoirs or things like that do seem to they take that sort of mitigated risk, but also it's the mitigated risk of people who have already survived the worst of the worst or things like that. So I think part of the problem is just trying to figure out how do you leave open this space that actually allows for something where people can give trusted or trusting testimonies.
That's a fantastic question, Jake. How do we, how can people take risks? I mean, Henry Anonymous showed up with a mask, right? And his voice was heard and things have changed and so on and so forth, but like, can we really expect individuals to come forward? And in so far as we maybe privilege people with memoirs and usually like, and Ellen Sachs did not publish her memoir while she was still suffering at Oxford, right? Like she published it after she became an established, person and, survived in some regards or thrived and then published. So that's the real challenge. In fact, I just finished reading this book called Musings of So it's writing about their encounter with hospitalization after they were hospitalized for mental disorder. And then they decide to go into clinical psychology or social work to become a clinician. And then they report that the grad schools, a couple of them she applied at talked about, her blogs and her perception of the psychiatric system and whether she's a good fit to be a social worker. So much so that they ended up deleting and removing all of their blog posts. And that's why they published this book, because this contains all the pieces. So there is a big risk of stigma. And that's why I think the other expert community in this context, the DSM community, have to be really kind of forthcoming and show that they actually are open to this, that this is not a political stint, this is not a PR stint, they really care. That's why I kind of talked about like the trust, because trust is not going to emerge on its own. There needs to be an apology for the past harms. I mean, so many things have to happen, I think, for us to start kind of having that conversation, but that's definitely a legitimate barrier. Individuals would be risking their lives unless they are kind of in powerful positions and so on and so forth. But I think that's not also, let's just not undermine the importance of having some kind of privilege and having a say. And that's why I want to think more about this suggestion that, where maybe there can be some like interaction, like some experts who interact between different groups of expertise, and maybe philosophers of science are a good community for that, which is kind of following up with like Plaiston's like proposal in another context. But that's a very good question and a real challenge, Jake. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next question from Rachel Cooper.
Rachel.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your talk. So I guess, I agree with you that it would be good to have, more patients involved, like more directly in kind of shaping psychiatry. I wanted to ask you how you decide who counted as a patient. So it looks to me like there's two ways these things go, and both kind of lead to difficulties. So sometimes people can self-identify as part of a patient group, and then at least in some areas it looks like there's a risk that you get like the voices of people who are quite severely affected by a condition can be drowned out by those who are only maybe marginally affected by it. So arguably, I think maybe that might happen with things like autism, where there's lots and lots of people who will self-describe as kind of being a bit autistic, and they might say it's great or whatever, but then there's a worry. So there's a worry if it's you just self-identify that you can hear voices from people who maybe aren't kind of very severely affected by a condition. Or if you go the other way, if you have a more restricted notion of who counts as a patient, then you can have sometimes a kind of hierarchy developing, where it's like, I know if you're diagnosed with something that's seen as more serious, like if you're diagnosed with kind of schizophrenia or something like that, then you're kind of one up on people who've got a diagnosis of depression, or if you've been an inpatient, or if you've been legally detained. And then that also seems to be go a little bit odd. And so I guess, like, if you compare the case of kind of feminist epistemology, it's like women are more or less fairly clearly defined as a group. When it comes to patients, it's a lot more nebulous who's going to count as a patient. So I wondered what you thought about that.
That's a great question, Rachel. I don't know if I have an answer, except that when I was thinking about patients, and that's one reason, like, it's not a homogeneous group, and maybe it's not as easily kind of demarcatable as some of the other categories that we might have. I actually just looked this up because I remember thinking a lot about this as I was writing my dissertation like 10 years ago, and I ended up writing this long footnote about why I'm using the word patient and what I mean by it. And I kind of, again, like, define it very pragmatically, saying I consider, patients who are individuals who seek help and are diagnosed with a mental disorder in the DSM category. So that was kind of my, operational definition or pragmatic definition there. But then that definition does not necessarily include, for instance, someone in the Mad Pride movement, because they might have been labeled and diagnosed, but they don't consider themselves as patients, but they also don't seek to get better. They want better accommodation and so on and so forth. So that's, I think we have to come up with, some kind of like these like groups, like who, what does patient category involve. One of my former students, and we have a big medical humanities program here, she ended up writing actually what it means to be a good patient. And that was like kind of like very interesting, because she's like, everybody's talking about the importance of being a good doctor, but like, why are we not talking about like being a good patient and what does that involve? And her definition of some of the good patient actually rules out a lot of patients who are diagnosed with any kind of illness, because, and that doesn't mean that those who like abide by their categories and diagnosis and treatments, but like who reflect on themselves and their experiences and so on and so forth. So that's the real challenge and the question. But I think we can start somewhere. So I focus this discussion primarily on the DSM and DSM task force. There is no reason, I think, for the DSM task force not to include individuals who are diagnosed with a mental illness, who have some kind of experience, in the treatment context, and who have thought intelligently about the categories that they're labeled and the kinds of treatments that they received and so on and so forth. And we can start from there, and then kind of, think of the, patient community as a dynamic community and be receptive of individuals, different ways of being patient or different ways of or living with a mental disorder and so on and so forth. So I think that's the real challenge, but I think I see that more as an opportunity for good science rather than a limitation, because just like, the rich community of experts who have technical knowledge, like it's better if we have, biologists, neuroscientists, and anthropologists in the psychiatric research community. I think we can do a similar kind of, look for similar kind of diversity in the patient community. Thank you for that question, Rachel. Thank you.
So we'll take 2 last questions, and you can also see that there are some follow-ups and suggested readings in the chat. So I invite you to check them if you're interested. So next question is from Onur Kanpolat.
Yeah. Hi. Thank you very much for the presentation. It was so much helpful for me. And I have a more general question, and I'm not sure whether if it's appropriate or not. So I'm sorry if it's not. Well, what I'm trying to understand, it seems like to me that the participatory psychiatry, I would call it that way, it seems that we are trying to understand a specific condition, let's call it diseases. So we are trying to understand that phenomena, and we are trying to relate with that phenomena. And it seems to me that just because there is a possibility of conscious experience and conscious understanding of that situation, conscious understanding of what is it like to be in that situation, we infer from that possibility that this conscious perspective is necessary for us to understand the condition. So I'm not sure to what extent it is very much plausible to infer such conclusion, because I believe that, I'm not believing that, I'm just speculating with, would it be impossible for us to fully comprehend the phenomena that we are dealing with if we will lack a conscious subject, for example? So what if the patient, for example, is not conscious anymore, but still he or she is having that conditions? So would we say that it is not possible anymore for us to fully comprehend that situation just because there is no consciousness, there is no conscious report? Mm-hmm. So the question is that just because there's a conscious subject, does it necessarily mean that we need that conscious perspective, or is it just, can it be ignored basically?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's a great question, Onur. I I don't think it's inappropriate at all. I think that's a very relevant and important question. So similarly, you can say, well, there's a big philosophical literature about that. Well, we know that we're blind to ourselves and our experiences. Like, whatever we report, that's just kind of maybe some kind of confabulation, some kind of narrative. There's no like kind of truth to it. Or, in your case, well, maybe the person will not be able to kind of report and so on. Is that really necessarily part of the puzzle? I think it is. Like not in every instance, not in each case, but especially in the context where we are talking about helping people get better, whatever that might mean, right? And that I also, as I kind of responded to Natalia's question at the beginning, that like I take that, psychiatry is in crisis right now. There's a crisis in mental health research. There are people who are increasingly suffering from different kinds of mental distresses, further aggravated by the pandemic, of course, but also I think there's also kind of poverty of understanding about our mental experiences. And I think adding patients' own perspectives or voices, even if it does not track the, capital truth, like, the philosopher's truth, I think will be an important kind of part of the puzzle in kind of making sense of that complexity and crisis. So I think, a diet benefits from like a diversity of foods, and the more kind of pluralistic we are in the way that we think about mental disorders or mental health, the better off we will be, because seeking kind of singularity or reduction has not benefited us so far. And let's kind of give this a try. But those are definitely issues that need to be sorted, like how much authority we can attribute to a person's own self-report. Like, we know, in fact, with research in psychology, that that's not always the case. So, but yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Last question from Awais Aftab.
Hi, Awais.
Hello. Thank you so much for the great talk. I'm actually sort of like, I was lucky that I heard an earlier version of this during the
yes, you heard the baby version.
So,
yes.
So I've had some opportunity to think about it. One thing, so first I want to say that I'm very, very sympathetic to the overall argument, particularly as it relates to our general sort of like general psychiatric and scientific knowledge. That I think it's absolutely essential that patients, service users, and all of those sort of like, those voices be a part of the process of knowledge creation. So I think that, from that sort of like overarching perspective, I'm highly, highly sympathetic to the argument. I think things get a little tricky when we sort of like specifically talk about the DSM. And I think sort of like, I think there's a bit of a mismatch, because I think in the public's perception, DSM sort of like represents the sort of like or knowledge, sort of like it sort of like represents a sort of like psychiatry's like version of what, like how we should best understand psychiatric conditions. And so it's rather unfortunate that the document has sort of like, attained that significance in the general consciousness, because it was never intended to be sort of the thing. It was sort of like, it had sort of like very specific pragmatic, administrative, and research purposes of its own. It was intended to accomplish certain tasks. It was never intended to be sort of like this know-all thing for the manual, for the specialty. So, for example, it was never intended to be something that captures the phenomenology of the conditions. Like, that was never a part of sort of like what the manual was for. So even though we have a lot of sort of like other research that is very rich in phenomenology, like that has little to do with sort of like what the DSM is intended to do. So one thing I want sort of like, I want to ask you is that, are we limiting ourselves when we sort of like focus on DSM to this extent? Sort of like, like what is it that we are hoping, what specific goals of the DSM are we hoping we would accomplish by, having more participation from patients and service users? Like, is the goal to like make the conditions more reliable? Is it to like better delineate depression from anxiety? If the goal is for sort of like, for the patient's voices to be heard regarding their experiences of sort of like experiences, what it is like to be depressed, what it is like to be anxious, then maybe DSM is not the best venue for that. Maybe we need to think outside the box and look at the other options. Why not a manual sort of like created by expert patients for how patients should understand these conditions? I'm just like worried that we're trying to sort of like have one manual be the solution for everything. And this is particularly considering that the DSM process is extremely conservative, that most of the recommendations by the task forces never make it to the final product, because they're shot down either by the scientific review committee, by the board of trustees. So the process as it stands right now, it's still like, it disqualifies the opinions of most clinicians, most researchers, and in fact, most of the opinions of the task force itself, they never make it to the end product. So when the process is so conservative, how can we imagine that even if we add patient voices to the task forces, that would change anything?
That's great. I love this question, Awais, because it's, I think, giving me a lot of opportunity to kind of talk about like this thing. So I fully agree with you that the DSM never intended this, but also DSM, I think, did not object to the power that it ended up receiving. And, maybe nobody kind of knew, none of the creators like thought about, oh, now we're going to be called the Bible of psychiatry. But in effect, when you write in your introduction very clearly, there are all these tasks and purposes that we are doing this. We're going to be used in the diagnosis. We're going to be used for research. We're going to be used for educational purposes. We're going to be used for like administrative purpose. And you actually, I think they primarily copy paste that paragraph from like all the DSMs. You can read the same long paragraph in each introduction of each of the DSMs that they are going to serve all of these purposes. I think that's a misguided project. Like we should recognize that one area of science, and this in that case, in this kind of context, this is like one of the epistemic rituals, included in the kind of general psychiatric practices. It's kind of, identifying itself like the thing that will solve all of these problems. And in the past work, I have argued that DSM should try to be everything for all purposes. And I think if I agree with you, that's why I kind of like to kind of distinguish the DSM from the DSM culture. The kind of unintended consequence of maybe, having served for all, or being designed to serve for all these purposes, is that it shaped the public and the individual understanding of mental illness to a like large degree. Like if you can't get a psychiatric report or if you can't get your insurance coverage for your pills unless you are given a label, right? In that kind of system, it does become this like huge epistemic authority, even though that is not like the intended purpose. So I think like one step that DSM can take is like, you know what, like we'll just stop being everything for everything. Or like psychiatrists yourselves, I think like we can do a better job of eliminating and enlightening the public that this is not really, we are not trying to we are not as powerful as kind of, as we are, but I worry that that's actually going to happen because there's a lot of money involved in kind of being the main book that does all of these things. So I think like a lot of other things comes into play that I kind of want to resist, that like psychiatry or the DSM creators or the DSM is almost like a kind of victim in all of this like perception. I think it needs to try to kind of alter public's perception of itself by making it clear that, we can't really use just like medicine, right? Like the word medicine captures a lot of individuals like branches. You can't really expect a brain surgeon to be very good at like pandemic response or something like that, right? So why not like kind of embrace this more a pluralistic conception of like mental health and mental research, and so those goals of like administration, clinical purposes, diagnosis, and so on, come apart. So I tried that. I still like kind of stand behind that idea. But lately I've been thinking, well, if there's still insistence on creating, the second version of the DSM-5 and so on, like why not then we're kind of trying to open this up more. And I think I'm, I totally hear you. Like, I think the personality disorders, right? Like when the DSM-5, it was supposed to be more dimensional, in the last minute, they kept things the same. And those kind of the work of those tasks, those working groups didn't make it to the final version. And maybe there's a problem with that, right? So I think it has to come both ways. Like we need to maybe pushing for maybe alternative frameworks, alternative scientific frameworks, but money is in play. I mean, until very recently, a lot of the NIH funding, which is the largest institution in the United States and around the world that funds mental health research, was contingent upon whether or not you propose your research subjects to be diagnosed with DSM manual. I mean, so like if I wanted to create an alternative framework for mental disorder research, I don't know who would support me and like fund me, right? So I think that's why, like, if psychiatry, if the DSM task force, if they're really caring about doing good science that will help people and be used for all of these purposes, then they need to be held more accountable. I think that's why, you know, social and political reasons for pushing for patients' inclusion also kind of, I think, you know, serve the purposes that I want like patients to play in, you know, from an epistemic perspective. But I don't know, we should write something together maybe, because I really, really want to talk to you more about this, about like what happened? Like this was never intended to be, and like now how did we end up here where there's this like almost weird conceptual like monopoly on the way we think about mental health.
That'll be great. I'm very open to collaboration. I'll just make a brief comment because I know we're kind of over time.
We're very out of time, yeah.
I'll just say it briefly. I think I agree with you. I think, you know, the preferred response might be to sort of like deprive the DSM of the power it has, rather than give it more power by sort of like, you know, making it sort of like, you know, the representative of the patient community as well. Yeah. And the manual is like very poorly designed to serve that function.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But I worry. I mean, I still kind of I think I'm going to continue to publicly criticize the DSM because it's still affecting so many lives, and you know, and it's still like changing the way people perceive it themselves, like in a very deep way that is very problematic. So, yeah, but yeah, let's think about this. This is great. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we're over time. We'll have to stop here. Thank you very much, Serife, and thank you everyone for being here today. You know that you can, each of you, I think, take the content of the chat and save it on your computer.
You know, I was actually just going to ask that. How can I save it?
Yeah, I think you can do that by clicking on chat, and then there are like 3 little dots at the right bottom. You click there and you can save chat. If
you're such an expert on this,
I'm learning.
Fantastic.
So next session is in 2 weeks, and we'll hear Mohammed Aboulay